Hi, everybody. I would like to welcome all our guest speakers and, of course, Konstantin Vika today, as well as all the participants. I will just briefly introduce Changer. So you will just give me a minute, Konstantin, and then I will give you the floor. So for those of you that haven't actually participated in any other webinar of Changer, Changer is an EU-funded project. We actually just entered the second year of the project, which is about adaptations which are necessary in the ethics review, especially in what we call in the changing research environment, which actually includes novel and disruptive technologies, participatory research, and new players in research. So as part of Changer, we will be mainly developing new methodologies for the ethics review process. So today I'm really happy that we will cover immersive technologies, and I'm very looking forward to hearing to your talks. So Konstantin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vicky, and welcome, a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you to our speakers today. It's a wonderful lineup, I guarantee for them. So, immersive research, ethical challenges, morality and responsibility in virtual reality. This is the second Changer webinar and the first of this year. What we're gonna explore virtual reality, gonna explore mixed reality, and how to do ethically, morally research within them or with them. We have three experts for today, Catherine Francis, Mihaela Constantinescu, and Anda Zahiu. And I will let them, of course, to present their own perspectives. But until then, let's do just a short introduction to this topic, which is a timely topic, an essential one, at least in the last 2 or 3 years for research. Historically, moral philosophers, psychologists, sociologists, they relied on text-based vignettes to study decision-making, moral decision-making, and so on and so forth. While effective in controlled environments, these methods often lacked the contextual depth of real-world scenarios, and VR has emerged as a groundbreaking tool, offering immersive and contextually rich environments to study behavior, any kind of behavior. These advances enable researchers to examine moral decision-making in ways that were previously hard to imagine, before providing greater ecological validity and deeper insights into human morality. But while VR offers a huge potential for understanding and augmenting moral behavior, it also introduces a set of ethical challenges for researchers. The use of advanced technologies like haptic feedback, for example, or EEG or eye tracking. Uh, in this simulation, this use raises questions about consent, about manipulation, and the long-term impact on neuroplasticity of participants. As these tools become more integrated into research, it is critical to develop ethical guidelines to address issues of agency, privacy, and responsible use. And the metaverse itself introduces a new dimensions of these discussions. In virtual worlds where avatars represent individuals and sometimes organizations, the boundaries of agency and moral responsibility are increasingly complex. Persistent interactions between avatars blur distinctions between individuals and collective actions, requiring us, the researchers, to rethink how we assign moral responsibility in this kind of hybrid environments. And beyond its role as a research tool, VR holds a promise to be a kind of morality lab for enhancing human capacities, such being empathic or having a pro-social behavior. By combining VR with advanced technologies like physiological sensors, researchers can examine the gap between moral judgments, for example, and actions, providing empirical insights into long-standing debates in moral philosophy and moral psychology. However, this dual potential also presents a lot of risks. For example, if it is misused, immersive technologies, or they are misused, immersive technologies could exploit human neuroplasticity, and they can lead to even unintentional or unintended consequences for individual agents. So, as we gonna navigate that transformative era, it is vital, I guess, to approach these technologies with care and especially with responsibility. So we have to ask ourselves, how can virtual reality be used ethically to advance research and moral understanding and social understanding? What new responsibilities do researchers have when using VR simulations that elicit, for example, powerful emotional and behavioral responses in participants? And last but not least, how can we ensure that VR-based research respects participants' autonomy and they avoid unintended psychological or social consequences? So these are some of our directions for today. Let me introduce our first speaker. I'm talking about Catherine Francis, who is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Leeds, and where she leads the Moral Minds Lab. The lab investigates moral conflict using innovative methods such as virtual reality, simulation, and is doing this across applied contexts, including bioethics and medical decision making, but also within this lab, they talk about sustainable behaviors in the context of both pro environmental decision making and human animal relationship. Catherine Francis, she is an active member of the Experimental Psychological Society and also an active member of the European Association of Social Psychology. She will talk today about ethical and methodological challenges in virtual morality research. Thank you for joining us today, Catherine, and you have the digital floor.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to share my screen first. So bear with me a second and we'll make sure that's working. Can everyone see the slides? Perfect. Thank you. And yeah, thank you for such a wonderful introduction, Konstantin. I think the change your endeavor is an important one. And you've done a lot of the legwork for me already at the beginning of my talk, which is always welcome. So as Konstantin said, a lot of the work that I've done has been on implementing and using virtual reality and immersive technologies to understand and measure moral decision making. And because I know we have quite an interdisciplinary audience, the approach I've taken with the talk today is to break it down into sort of three chunks. So I'll sort of walk you through how I've navigated this. So the first chunk will be a rapid introduction to moral psychology for those of you who aren't moral psychologists. And that's really to give you a sense of some of the methodological challenges that we face in this field, which were nicely touched on a moment ago anyway. Then I'll talk about how I've been using virtual reality to address some of these challenges. And then I'm going to end with some reflections on further methodological and ethical challenges. But I will talk about various ethical challenges throughout the duration of the talk today. Okay, so let's dive straight in. So if we want to talk about moral psychology, the first thing we should probably talk about is morality. So what is morality? And if I ask each of you to spend a few minutes thinking about that, you'll probably all have an immediate intuitive reaction to this question. You might all have a sense of what you believe is moral, what you believe is immoral. There'll be shared understandings between all of us about what that looks like, but there also might be a lot of individual differences between us based on cultural differences, religious differences, upbringing, and so on. And the way that I like to think about morality is through using cases, through using kind of imaginative scenarios. And I'm going to do that throughout the talk today. So get ready to start imagining lots of different situations. So I want you to imagine that we all get up from our desks right now and we leave our houses. And what you're going to do is walk to the bank because you need to get some money out. Now, as you approach the bank, you're going to go to the hole in the wall, pop your card in and get some cash out. But when you get there, you realize that actually there's already some money sitting there. So someone's left it there by accident. Now, what do you do in this situation? There's a number of different things you might do. So some of us might stand there cautiously waiting for somebody to show up. Some of us might take the money and hold it as if we're guarding it until someone approaches us looking for it. Some of us might take it, walk into the bank and give it to members of staff in the bank. Some of us might take that money and pocket it for ourselves. And what you're doing in that situation is not just determined by the context and the surroundings, things going on around you. It's also determined by your moral values. So it's determined by what you believe is right and wrong in that given situation. And that's how I like to think about morality. So it's what we think is right and wrong about our actions and our thoughts. And if we were to formalize that, we could talk about morality as certain codes of conduct that are put forward by society or by a group. Now, the challenge comes in the next part. So as a moral psychologist, I want to measure and understand morality. But it's this big, multifaceted, complex concept. And as I said before, we might have some shared understandings of what that looks like, but there's also going to be lots of differences between us. So how do we measure something like that? And the approach that moral psychologists have typically taken is to break morality down into component parts. And these are sort of the component parts that I'm interested in. So firstly, I'm interested in how people make moral judgments, and I'm interested in modeling and mapping that. So how do people decide what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad? And that's called a moral judgment. But as a psychologist, I'm not just interested in what people say they're going to do. I'm interested in what they actually do in a situation when the stakes are present. And that really feeds into moral action. So how do people behave in light of their moral judgments? So how do people act based on what they believe is right and wrong and good and bad? And obviously, emotion and motivation play a role in there too. And a lot of the work that I've done has actually looked at the relationship between these two things. So, do moral judgments map nicely onto moral actions? Do people do what they say they're going to do? So crash course in moral psychology. So now we've got these component parts that are a little bit more easy for us to digest. We now have to think about how we're going to explicitly measure them in participants, in research studies. So how do we go about doing that? So if I want to understand how people decide what's right and what's wrong, and if I want to observe and measure what they do based on what they believe is right and wrong, I need to put them in situations where they're having to make a decision and when there's some kind of moral conflict. And the way that philosophers and psychologists have typically approached this is by using moral dilemmas. So they're called dilemmas because there are two moral requirements of you in that situation, but you can't do both. So you're forced to choose one, and that generates this moral conflict. And they've become a really nice tool and a reasonably efficient way of testing different moral schools of thought or different moral tensions. So again, let's walk through one of these together because it's more fun. So let's take another example where you're going to leave the house again. So everybody imagine you're standing up and you're leaving your house. This time you're running to catch a bus. And as you're running to catch this bus, there's a person who's walking in front of you and they've got lots of shopping bags full of food products. And one of those bags breaks and food falls out all over the floor. So there's apples rolling everywhere and it's chaos. And you've got to decide whether you're going to stop and help this person pick up all this shopping or whether you're going to run and catch your bus. Because if you stop and help, you'll miss your bus. But if you run to catch your bus, you're not going to be helping. And so again, what you're deciding to do in that situation might rely on lots of different contextual features, things going on around you, but it will also depend on what you believe is right or wrong in that situation. The nice thing about these moral dilemmas is we can raise and lower the stakes quite easily, and we can manipulate certain things to see if they affect your decision. So I could, for example, give you more features or characteristics and descriptions of this person who's dropped their shopping. So I could tell you that it's a young mother, she's got a toddler holding one of her hands, all the shopping's in the other hand, and so when she drops the food everywhere, she's now trying to manage her child and the shopping, and that might influence and change your decision. Or I could up the stakes of you being late for that bus. So perhaps you're running to catch the bus because you need to administer medication for a loved one. And that really does start to shift and change your decision about what's valuable or what's important in this situation. Now, I'm particularly interested in very high stakes moral decision making, so life and death decision making. And the kinds of moral dilemmas we've used to tap into this and measure these kinds of decisions are sacrificial moral dilemmas. And the most famous example of a sacrificial moral dilemma is the trolley problem. And I'm sure that many of you in the room right now will have heard of the trolley problem, but I'm going to walk you through these cases because methodologically I want to unpick them a little bit more further down the line. So again, I want you to engage in this imaginative exercise. And I want you to think about what you would do or what you would say in response to these cases as I'm walking you through them. So the trolley problem has two component parts. So it has the switch dilemma and the footbridge dilemma. So I will walk you through these one by one. So let's look at the switch dilemma first. So again, imagine these events as if they were playing out in real life. So there's a runaway train car or a runaway trolley heading down a set of tracks, and it's heading down these tracks at speed towards 5 construction workers, and you can see them there on the right-hand side of the track. Now, if it continues on its present course, it's going to hit and it's going to kill those 5 people. And actually, from where you're standing, you can't warn them. They wouldn't be able to hear you. But instead, you're standing next to this switch. You can see it in the slides. And if you choose to flick this switch, the runaway train car or the runaway trolley will head down the neighboring track on the left instead. But at the end of this neighboring track is a single construction worker, so they'll be killed instead. So if you were a participant in a moral psychology experiment, I would present this moral dilemma to you, and then I would ask you something like this. So I would ask you, is it morally acceptable to flick the switch, sacrificing one life in order to save 5 lives? And you can think about this now and how you might respond to this question. And what you typically find across moral psychology studies is quite a high percentage of people saying yes in response to this question. So they give what's called this characteristically utilitarian response. So they're endorsing the idea that it's, it's valuable to save one life. It's valuable to sacrifice one life to save 5 lives. Okay, so now let's look at the counterpart dilemma. And again, think about how you might respond to this case instead. So the footbridge dilemma is similar in the events that are playing out. So there's a runaway train car, it's still heading down the tracks towards those 5 construction people. They'll still be killed if it continues on its present course, and you still cannot warn them from where you're standing. But this time there's a footbridge or a construction bridge standing above those, over those tracks. And standing on top of that bridge is a person carrying a very large, heavy hiking rucksack. And you're actually standing next to that person. And what you might do, or what you could do in this situation, is push that person off the bridge onto the track below, where the large bulk of their combined body and rucksack would derail the runaway train car. And again, you're making this decision about whether it's morally acceptable to sacrifice one life in order to save 5 lives. And it's worded slightly differently. So is it morally acceptable to push this person off the footbridge? And again, think about what you might say in response to this. And I would imagine that for the most part, you've all had quite different intuitive responses to this dilemma compared to the previous one. And that's for various different reasons that we can talk about in the Q&A if anyone's interested. But what you typically get with these types of cases, these footbridge cases, is a much lower percentage of people saying yes in response to this question. So far fewer people give these kind of utilitarian responses. Now, when I started working in this field of research, there was a lot of focus on developing cognitive and dual process models of moral decision making that would explain why people respond so differently to these two cases despite their structural similarity. So they still have that 1 to 5 trade-off. But I actually was far more interested in the method and the approach we were taking to measure these moral judgments. So I'm going to focus on that. So let's take a look at this from a methodological perspective. So if you were a a participant coming to take part in one of these experiments, you wouldn't even be presented with a diagram that I just showed to you. You'd be presented with a text-based vignette, and you can see that in the slide here. And I'd give you time to read this vignette, and then I'd ask you to respond to a moral judgment question, which I just did. So I'd ask you, is it morally acceptable to perform this particular action? You would say yes or no. And at the time that I became interested in this method, there was a group of researchers who introduced this new type of question, and they called it an action choice question. So instead of just asking, is it morally acceptable, they would ask, would you do it? And that's become known as an action choice question. And there was really early emerging evidence that people responded very differently to an action question compared to how they responded to a judgment question. And that was being used as a way of talking about kind of this moral judgment action discrepancy. So people say they would do something, but actually they wouldn't when it comes to it. And I was very interested in this approach because to me, presenting someone with a text-based vignette and then asking them to imagine a situation and then asking them, would you do this, still feels very hypothetical in nature. So I still felt like this was very much tapping into a moral judgment, even if it was a different form of moral judgment. But then we face a big challenge about how we start to measure and understand moral behavior in these kinds of cases. So we know from plenty of areas of other research, as well as sort of everyday life, that people display quite a lot of moral inconsistency. So typically, people do not do what they say they're going to do, and I'm sure we've all got first-hand experiences of this. But when it comes to trying to understand and measure moral behavior or moral action in this domain, the domain of morality of harm, there are two significant issues that we face. The first challenge is a methodological one. So again, if you all imagine standing up and leaving your houses right now and going to your nearest train station, you're not likely to witness the footbridge dilemma or the switch dilemma taking place. They're very extreme, far-fetched cases, and they're designed that way for experimental control. But it becomes very difficult to do any field-based work to increase ecological validity and trying to understand behavior. So we can't really take participants to those situations because they don't really happen. But secondly, and perhaps more critically, there's an ethical challenge. So even if I could, it would be completely inappropriate for me to expose participants to those kinds of life and death decisions. And this is really where the sort of virtual reality simulation slotted into the picture. So by using virtual reality, we can generate moral dilemmas that can both look and feel very realistic while protecting the welfare of participants. And this is really how I moved into this area of research. Okay, so that leads nicely into part two then. So how did we start to think about sort of embedding virtual reality into this work? So I'm going to go right back to the beginning and show you some really early studies that I did in this area. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about the clear methodological differences between using a text-based moral dilemma and using a virtual reality constructed version of the same moral dilemma. So in the slide, you can see at the top an older version of the footbridge case, and along the bottom, you can see lots of different types of sacrificial moral dilemma. For simplicity today, we're going to focus on the footbridge dilemma. So when you think about building a virtual reality version of a moral dilemma like the footbridge, you've got features now that you wouldn't have needed to think about with a text-based case. So you now have visual and auditory salience. So you are building the entire soundscape in that environment. So you're deciding if there are going to be atmospheric and environmental sounds. You're deciding if the avatars in that situation are going to respond to participants, if they're going to make sounds, are they going to talk? And we can talk more about the ethical issues around that afterwards. But you're also measuring and able to measure actions in the moment of decision making, because that event is playing out in real time like it would in real life. Whereas with a text-based vignette, you're relying on reading speed. So the process is very different and the temporal features are very different. Okay, so let's show you some of the empirical work. So at the very beginning, I was simply interested in comparing responses to the original text-based moral dilemmas to the responses in the virtual reality simulations of those same cases. And I'll take you back to the very beginning. So this was a study that I collected data for 10 years ago. So this was in 2015. And this was with one of the original development versions of the Oculus headsets. And we had two separate groups of participants. So we had one group respond to a text-based version of the footbridge dilemma. And I got them to respond to both of the questions that I talked to you about. So is it morally acceptable? Would you do it? So we'll call them the text group. And then we had a separate group of participants immerse themselves in this virtual reality version of the footbridge dilemma. Now, if in the virtual reality moral dilemma, participants wanted to push the person off the footbridge, they would push forward with a joystick. If they wanted to completely refuse that, they would just omit a response altogether. We'll call them the VR group. So I will show you the text-based data first. So along the y-axis, you've got the percentage of responses. The white bars are them saying no, so they're giving non-utilitarian responses. The purple bars are where they've said yes, so those are utilitarian responses. And what you can see for the text-based vignette responses, it maps exactly what we would expect based on how people typically respond to the footbridge dilemma. So most people are saying, in fact, 80% or more of them are saying, no, it's not morally acceptable to push the person. No, I wouldn't do it. So that maps onto what we would expect. What happened in virtual reality was actually the complete opposite. So in VR, we had a complete flip response. So most participants, 70% of them, actually pushed the person off the footbridge. And what we found, so this was in a student sample, we then replicated this in the general public, and since then have replicated it in lots of different populations, and I'll show you a few others. So you get the same pattern in training paramedics, and you get the same pattern in fire service professionals as well. And I'll show you one more empirical study that brings in haptics into the picture too. So in some of this work, I also wanted to think about physical contact and personal force and how that plays a role in moral decision making. So for this study, I worked with roboticists, and we incorporated this big virtual reality robot called the V-Bot. And it can simulate physical resistance force, so it can make actions feel real. So if you pair it with a virtual reality moral dilemma, say the footbridge dilemma again, participants can push forward with that robotic arm, and you can simulate the sensation of actually pushing a person who springs away from you if you push hard enough. And we actually ran this setup with 15 different moral dilemmas, including the footbridge dilemma. And I'll show you the results for this study too. So again, this is averaged across all 15 of those cases. Again, one group does it in the traditional format, we'll call them the text group, and one group does it in the VR haptic format. So again, you'll see that with the text-based sort of data in the traditional format, the majority of responses are non-utilitarian, which is what we would expect. So across those 15 cases, most people are saying, no, it's not morally acceptable to do this particular thing. No, I wouldn't do it. But with haptic VR, even average across 15 different cases, you still get a very different pattern of responses. So when simulated action is involved, the pattern tends to be more utilitarian. Okay, there's quite a few other studies that we've done, and I haven't got time to talk about them now, but I'm happy to talk more about them during the Q&A. But just to give you a sense of the kind of evidence we've got now for this judgment action discrepancy, so across different virtual reality pieces of technology, across different haptic technologies now, not just in my lab, but in labs in the US and in Europe, we found evidence of this judgment action discrepancy. So people don't tend to be doing what they say they would do in these kinds of cases. And this evidence for a moral judgment action discrepancy also extends beyond VR sacrificial moral dilemmas into altruistic dilemmas where you're making decisions about potentially sacrificing yourself as well. Okay, so in the last section, I just want to reflect more broadly on some methodological and ethical considerations as we move forward in this research area. So one of the things that psychologists and anyone who works with sort of experimental work is wrestling with is the balance between ecological validity and experimental control. And most of the time, there's a trade-off between these two things. So ecological validity means that your experiment has findings that can generalize to the real world context. Experimental control means that you're controlling for all the other extraneous confounding variables that could be affecting your data. So typically, when you increase one of those, the other one is forced to decrease. And that's always been a challenge, I think, for experimental and empirical work. And the reason why I've included a driving simulation in this slide is I think it's a really good example of what VR can offer here. So say you're an experimental psychologist and you're interested in how attention affects driving behavior. If you want to get high ecologically valid findings, you need to sit in a car with a participant and take measurements while they're driving in the real world. But if you do that, you can't control the neighborhood kid kicking a football into the road, right? If you want high experimental control, you might run your attention studies in a lab, but then you're no longer in a car in a real driving situation. VR's solution is to simulate driving, and you have control then over everything that happens in the scene while making it look and feel real for the participant. And I really do think this is an important strength of VR simulation. Now, when it comes to the work we're doing, we need to think beyond ecological validity. So if you think about a trolley problem, as I said before, it doesn't typically happen in the real world. So it's very hard to talk about ecological validity because what are we generalizing to if those extreme cases aren't actually happening? And there are other types or components of ecological validity we need to start to consider when we run these kinds of studies. And the first of those is something called perspectival fidelity. So perspectival fidelity is when you create a simulation that is an accurate representation of the subjective point of view of a neurotypical human being. So, and you can see me in the left here playing around in Unity with perspectival fidelity. But as a really clear example of this, if I go into a virtual simulation and I'm floating above something, flying through the sky, that's very low perspectival fidelity. If, on the other hand, I go into a VR moral dilemma and I'm standing at the height I would expect to be, I have increased perspectival fidelity. And these features are incredibly important for accuracy and immersion, and they're not really discussed enough at the moment. The sort of counterpart concept is context realism, and this is about the content itself. So you need to have a simulation that's believable, and this is challenging when it comes to creating moral dilemmas in virtual reality. But one thing you can do is generate features of the scene that make things feel more believable. So again, this is me playing around in a moral dilemma, building a storm, or what I hope is an authentic storm, above a scene so that once participants are immersed, they can see a realistic storm and feel like it's more believable. But as I said, a lot of these very extreme cases that we work with, these sort of impossible world cases as well, can be far-fetched. And so we can limit context realism to some degree. And one thing that I think we definitely should touch on is this concept that I call sensory similarity. So for a long time, there's been concepts and experiences that are very interesting to both philosophers and psychologists, if not many other disciplines, that have largely been ignored in empirical and experimental work because they've been very hard to simulate and measure. So now we can measure these sensations and experiences in a way not previously possible. And this does introduce a number of ethical challenges that have yet to be considered and addressed. So we're thinking about immediacy, pressure, presence, touch, how we can study people's moral decisions in demanding situations and the effect that that simulation can have on them after they've had measurement taking place. We can observe people doing actions under pressure where the stakes are really high, and we really have to start thinking about the consequences of doing that. And at the moment, a lot of ethical procedures don't take those things into account. And I'll just wrap up with this quote from a participant. So whenever we create simulations in virtual reality, we create them in a way that makes them look quite gamified. It would be possible to make them look hyper-realistic, but really that would defeat the point of using virtual reality in the first place. So it's absolutely critical as the technology advances, we remember why we were constructing them in the first place. So it's to simulate a moral case or a high demanding, stressful situation, but in a way that protects the welfare of participants. And if your participant leaves an experience changed in any way, it's really important that we debrief and that we're very careful about how we move forward with that as these technologies advance. But I will end there and just show you a few interesting technologies that are on the market, but we can come back to those afterwards because that's just me nerding out on all the new technology. But just to thank all my collaborators, and I look forward to the discussion at the end of today's session.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you for your fascinating talk. It seems that it is more dangerous to know how to code in Unity and to have VR set than to have a backpack on a bridge. Thank you again for your very rich proposal how to think about researching in VR. We wait for questions and we'll have a discussion at the Q&A session. Thank you. We move forward to our next speaker. I'm talking about Mihaela Constantinescu. She's a lecturer at the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Bucharest, and also the executive director of the Research Center in Applied Ethics from the University of Bucharest. She serves as the principal investigator at the Avatar Responsibility Project, at large Avatar Agency Moral Responsibility at the intersection of individual, collective, and artificial social entities in emergent avatar communities. This 5-year project is funded by the European Research Council. Her research focuses on virtue ethics, business ethics, human-robot interaction, and AI ethics, particularly examining the normative interplay between moral responsibility and moral agency in relation to individuals, organizations, and AI systems. Today, she will talk about moral responsibility and avatar communities in the metaverse. So, Mihaela, you have the digital floor.
Many thanks, Konstantin. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for being here. Many thanks for the invitation. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint right in a moment. Okay, and you should now very nice see it. So I'm pretty happy that I'm following up Catherine because she's been talking about experimental studies, empirical work. I'm going to take the perspective of normative philosophy and delve into the ethics of AI and avatars, particularly. Avatars that aren't necessarily restricted to the metaverse, but the things I'm going to talk about also refer or relate to VR experiments. So hopefully this will draw, although I'm not going to work or to present directly topics related to research ethics concerning avatars, but hopefully these insights coming from philosophy and technology, AI ethics, avatar ethics would inform discussions over research ethics in VR. So without further ado, I'd rather start with discussing a little bit the terminology that we've been witnessing lately, because we're talking about digital twins, digital duplicates, digital doppelgangers, but also personal avatars and generative agents. And oftentimes we talk about them interchangeably. However, there are some differences, and I'm going to start with this contextual discussion. Basically, I'm going to use the expression of digital avatars, but just let's get back to digital twins, duplicate, and doppelgangers, because they usually refer to having a perfectly human replica in the virtual sphere. And this is the sense in which digital twins, duplicates, and doppelgangers have been used interchangeably. However, when we discuss about avatars, we might refer to avatars that don't necessarily embody a human being. They might embody maybe a corporation that is present in the virtual environment. And now more recently, and I'm going to come back with the idea of generative agents. But first, when it comes to digital avatars, the thing that complicates maybe our discussions and our empirical work even more is the latest combination between digital avatars and multimodal language models, resulting in what we might call generative AI avatars. Which can mirror the exact preferences of individual human persons, not only in physical terms, but also in terms of psychology. Maybe one of the best known companies so far that manages to generate perfectly realistic generative AI avatars that mimic the physical presence, but also the tone voice, the type of language that people use is this company called Synthesia. And to go fast forward to generative agents, we have these recent advancements that have just been released that refer to empirical research conducted on over 1,000 participants that managed to create quite a precise replica of the personality of the participants after just a 2-hour long interview. So what happened was that the designers of the empirical studies combined large language models with personal I would call them avatars of the people interviewed. And when they were put to psychological and sociological tests after this 2-hour interview, there was more than 80% similitude between the answers received from these generative agents, as the empirical study named them, and the real human participants. And to discuss a little bit more about the focus of my own research on AI avatars, particularly on avatars powered by generative AI technologies, let me just highlight that most of the people usually work with this notion of personal avatars, referring to the classical terminology, whereby we would discuss about teleoperated, digital or robotic embodied representations of an individual human persons in either virtual or physical environments, and which enable the controller to interact with objects, users, or other entities. What complicates this topic even more is the fact that we can now combine not only general large language models with personal avatars, but we can also make use of personalized generative AI to combine them with human-looking like avatars. And they result in digital or robotic avatars that are trained on a personalized corpus of data to reason and to act in the manner of the human controller, or even to complement or enhance the capabilities of the human controller, even when the human is out of the loop and does not control the avatar in real time. And the examples previously shown by Synthesia are such an example. However, we might also have a human operator in the loop. So these personal generative AI avatars, namely avatars that resemble a specific human person and also draw on large language models, can either be fully teleoperated, can be partly teleoperated, but can also have no form of teleoperation. So, and to complicate things even more, then in environments such as, in technologically enabled environments such as the metaverse, but also in VR studies, and Catherine has previously presented some of the shortcomings of using avatars in empirical studies, we might either use these virtual reality avatars, which actually don't fully mimic the human body, but the more advanced technology would also enable having a fully body avatar, which requires some haptical gloves and costumes, and which make things more complicated from a research design setup, but then manage to capture more realistically the human body. Then again, maybe, and this is maybe a relevant thing to discuss thoroughly in the Q&A session, as Catherine has already pointed out, it's important to maybe discuss also the limits of using this type of realistic setup. But beyond the idea of having research design setups, we still have these communities that are rather emerging in the metaverse and either virtual spaces, and which maybe refocus the prior discussions regarding research ethics when it comes to synthetical training data, which used to be this solution offered by some that would generate synthetic human profiles that would, of course, be more efficient in terms of costs and time and scalability, but then would bring issues regarding extrapolation, whether using synthetically generated human profiles would actually offer truly relevant research results. So coming back to the idea that goes beyond the limits of research experiments, research setups, avatars, or the possibility of having these technologically enabled environments such as the metaverse, point to the possibility of having persistent and continuous use of multiple avatars by both humans and organizations that rely on highly autonomous AI systems, and more recently on generative AI, engaging in multiple interactions with other avatars and the environments, which result in various intertwined relationships that permit the boundaries of the physical, the augmented, and the virtual world. And from the point of view of philosophers working in the realm of morality, and particularly in applied ethics, one of the important questions to ask is to what extent does this persistent use of avatars affect ascriptions of agency and moral responsibility? It seems that the traditional hard line that we've been using for so many centuries is now blurred. The traditional hard line between the physical, the augmented, and the virtual reality. And this might challenge our traditional concepts of agency and moral responsibility, which were previously at least grounded in ontological and epistemological claims about the physical world. And it might even challenge the very notion of agency as a foundation for moral responsibility. So for the next part of my talk today, I'm going to deal with the possibility of discussing or developing a normative framework to ascribe moral responsibility in these types of emerging avatar communities. A normative framework that would consider the changing nature of agency in technologically enabled metaverse environments, and that would take into account issues such as the rise of avatar agency, the deceiving nature of avatars, including humanoid avatars, but not only, and also the enhancing or diminishing effect of avatar interface and avatar use on human agency and responsibility. And I'm going to discuss each of the 3 points briefly in what follows. So first of all, regarding the rise of avatar agency, metaverse spaces is the place where various social entities meet. So we have individuals, we have collectives, we have organizations that enable such environments, and we have various AI systems. We have a mix of virtual avatars, augmented avatars, and also cybernetic avatars, and discussions about the metaverse seem to extend beyond VR and also include augmented reality. And then generative AI avatars, extensively used, induce uncertainty with respect to entities performing actions. Is it the humans behind avatars? Is it organizations? Is it the avatar themselves? Can we discuss about a form of artificial agency, or is it only a mere impression? Another concern when it comes to discussing agency and moral responsibility related to avatar use in spaces such as virtual and augmented metaverse is the deceiving nature of avatars, particularly because we have these very realistic, humanistic representations. But even when we don't use such forms, we have this risk of fake avatars, as they have been called, avatars that present themselves as avatars of genuine human users, but are maybe company-owned and engage in conversational manipulation. Konstantin has already mentioned in the introduction the broad risks that metaverse brings along in terms of biometrical data use, neuroplasticity. And then we will have generative AI-powered avatars that are supposed to learn from the interaction with the environment, learn from the interaction with the other avatars in the metaverse, and enable their human controller to be out of the loop. So they would continue to exist in the metaverse even when their human counterpart is maybe sleeping or fading away. But then if that type of avatar maybe hangs around in the bad neighborhoods, takes up bad habits, when their user is out of the loop and they generate harm in these environments, how do we ascribe blame for the effects of these types of avatars? And finally, a troubling issue prompted out is the effect of avatar interface and the effect of avatar use on human agency in terms of enhancement or disenhancement. And we've been having a lot of debates in the bioethics field over moral enhancement. And this is a way to refocus those types of discussions in terms of avatars that seem to enhance users' physical and cognitive capabilities. They seem to bring about a form of enhancement of human agency. And as long as we really discuss about enhanced human agency, it seems that we should also take into account discussing ascribing more moral responsibility to users of avatars. But then again, and this is one of the things that we are discussing in our avatar responsibility project, it seems that avatars might also disenhance their users to some extent when it comes to perception of the environment, for instance, which turns to the other end of the questions, the other side of the coin. Do humans become less morally responsible through avatar use? So the basic question that, so one of the basic questions that we're focusing on when it comes to avatar use is how we ascribe moral responsibility for the outcomes of generative AI avatars, avatars powered by multimodal language models. And I was mentioning earlier that traditional criteria for moral responsibility might need to be rediscussed and revisited in light of these intertwined environments permitting the boundaries of the physical, the augmented and the virtual world. Some basic agreement in the community working on normative moral responsibility is that for an entity to meet criteria for moral responsibility, they will need to be in a form of relevant control over what they are doing, over their action, and also have the relevant understanding of what they are doing, understanding the context of their action, but also the implications of their action. These two criteria referenced in the literature as the control condition and the epistemic condition would, meeting them would amount to bearing moral responsibility for your own actions. And not that I'm taking moral responsibility to refer to that type of responsibility that is subject to moral evaluations in terms of blameworthiness and praiseworthiness. I'm not going to discuss very much further, just to point you to an article that I have been previously worked with some of the people here, including Anna and Konstantin. We were developing 4 criteria grounded in virtue ethics, normative theory, that an entity needs to meet in order to be ascribed moral responsibility. And what seems to be happening at this point when we have all these challenges brought about by avatar use in the metaverse and beyond, is that these criteria seem to be impacted by the flipping boundaries that I've just discussed. And one of the proposals resulting from our research project is that we need to approach these emergent avatar communities through a dynamic interactions approach, whereby we need to look to the interactions taking place between avatars, but also the technologically enabled environment whereby they can interact, and see the way the intertwined interactions between avatars of individuals, of collectives such as organizations, generate a mutually increasing or decreasing effects on agency and moral responsibility. We are, so for those interested, I'm just going to direct you at the end of my talk to the project's website to maybe gather your further questions or suggestions when it comes to discussing avatars in VR, metaverse, and descriptions of agency and moral responsibility. I'm thinking that my time is rather up, so I'm going to stop it here and wait for your questions in the Q&A session. Many thanks.
Thank you, Mihaela. Thank you, Miki, for this wonderful talk. I was wondering what's harder, or what is harder for us as researchers to fulfill the epistemic or the control condition when we do especially empirical research. Thank you again, and we'll come back to questions during the Q&A session. And now we are moving to our last speaker, Anda Zahiu, who is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Bucharest, and also a member of the Research Center in Applied Ethics. Her current PhD research focuses on the ethical and philosophical dimensions of tax and transfer redistributive schemes. With a background in moral and political philosophy, her research interests extend to new and emerging technologies, particularly virtual reality and digital avatar. She is also part of the Avatar Responsibility Project. Thank you, Anda, for being with us today. She's going to talk about everything, everywhere, all at once, VR as a morality lab. So, Anda, you have the digital floor.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. I love being the last speaker because basically, everyone did the groundwork. So just a second. Can you see the screen? Is everything okay? Okay, perfect. So the idea for this presentation came to me years ago after I read a research article written by Eric Ramirez and Scott Labarge. It was published in 2018 in Ethics and Information Technology. And they presented a very interesting argument for they called their argument the argument for symmetry, and they discussed some concept that Catherine mentioned before. Their argument was that at least in some cases it should be impermissible to simulate things in VR if we find those things to be impermissible in real life. And my initial reaction to this article was that I found the argument to be very problematic, to be very interesting, but philosophically weak. And I was very surprised now coming to this very old presentation to find out that my perspective on things changed quite a lot from 2018. Just being more exposed to VR experiments and seeing the technology develop in time. So today I'm going to present my newest stance on this subject, what I find to be permissible, and how we should identify the limits of permissibility in the context of virtual experiences in VR. Okay. So the first question I'll try to answer to, is there something uniquely interesting about VR? And I think that it is, and I think that Catherine did an amazing job at showing how VR can be put to use when it comes to research, in particular in moral psychology. But leaving moral psychology aside, I think that VR is uniquely fascinating in that it provides us with a virtual experience machine. And there are many ways in which we can call these virtual experiences. I love in particular the way in which Jeremy Badenson calls VR. He calls it the experience. He calls it a machine for experience on demand. In an older book that he published in 2011 with Blaskovich, he calls it infinite reality. And I think that this is the fascinating part of VR, that we can produce a lot of virtual experiences that are otherwise inaccessible to a lot of people. And this is why VR is popular with users, not as popular as other technologies, but certainly the popularity of the equipment increased in the last decade. So what is interesting about VR is that it engages a lot of our senses, not all of our senses, but it engages a lot of our senses. And the fact that VR, when certain technological conditions are met, is an immersive environment. So if certain criteria are met by the equipment, then we're going to have immersive experiences. And at the same time, immersion is positively correlated with presence. So the feeling of being there, of actually having that particular experiences. And as Catherine mentioned before, hyperimmersion is not derived from the realism of virtual objects. So we can have immersion without having a world that is a one-on-one replica of our real natural world. So what's particular about VR is that if the right conditions are met, and by the right conditions, I'm discussing about some technical conditions, VR acts as a brain hacker. So in a way, it overrides reality. It compels you to react to the stimuli that you are exposed to in those virtual experiences. And that is, I believe, uniquely interesting about VR, right? The fact that you are compelled to act in a certain manner. And we see this in VR users. We see the fact that they have very strong physiological reactions in certain contexts, right? They start sweating, their heart rate goes up, and in many situations they react as they would react in the real setting, the counterpart setting, and that is very interesting, even if we rationally know that we are not in that particular situation, that it is all make-believe. So that is, I think, uniquely interesting and uniquely important from a moral point of view when we discuss VR, that some things and some reactions are out of the rational control that we exercise over our own reactions, bodily reactions, mental reactions, and so on and so forth. We also see that virtual experiences are uniquely compelling because we notice this phenomena, this decrease in information clutter, right? So even if we would assume that people are exposed to more information, when they have a compelling virtual experiences, it is actually a lot easier um, to experience things in VR compared to other types of mediums, because our brains um, can simply not focus on specific information. Uh, so we kind of operate in a similar fashion to how we operate in our day-to-day um, interactions, by simply putting some things into parentheses. So we know how to focus on what is salient to us in virtual experiences. And also VR works so well because it plays on the sense that we use the most when we process information about the environment, and that is the human vision. So by providing us with a lot of visual stimuli, it helps with the immersion and the way in which we process information. Now, VR is used for many things, right? It is a research medium, a research tool, but it is also the object of research. And so we are also interested to find out what is the effect that virtual experiences carried out in VR have on human users. Or what are the effects of using particular or embodying certain types of avatars on different things, from our moral capacities to the way in which we process different information in particular contexts, to how it can modulate behavior and so on and so forth. So we have a dual research interest in VR. But VR is also used, obviously, for entertainment and social interaction purposes, for education, largely put. So I will include here training and simulations. VR simulations are probably some of the things that drive VR research and VR investments at the moment. But VR is also a clinical tool, or at least it has been used extensively during the past decades in therapy, in psychological therapy, but also in rehabilitation. So when we discuss about the uses of VR, we discuss about a wide range of applications. And now you might wonder, why is that so relevant? And I think it's relevant because we have to ask ourselves, why does it work in a variety of contexts, in a variety of situations? Why is VR so efficient, as far as we know? And the answer is that VR piggybacks on our neuroplasticity. And there are two types of neuroplasticity, and this is a very crude distinction. But basically, we can discuss about functional plasticity and structural plasticity, or as May called this type of plasticity, experience-dependent structural plasticity. So basically, when we discuss about functional plasticity, we discuss about our brain's ability to move functions from an area to another area. And usually one area is damaged when this thing has to happen. And there are many ways in which functional plasticity can come into play. I'm not going to get into all of them. But I'm just discussing this distinction so that we have a general picture of what we discuss about when we say neuroplasticity. And now structural plasticity, and this is probably more relevant for our discussion, is the brain's ability to change its neural connections as a result of learning and experience exposure. And this process is called by neuroscientists synaptic pruning. So by simply gaining new experiences or exercising certain functions, some connections, some neural connections are strengthened, whilst others are eliminated or simply reduced in functioning. Now, this is relevant because these two types of plasticity are used or are used by different VR applications. So functional plasticity comes into play when we discuss about neurotherapy and physical rehabilitation, and VR is heavily used for patients suffering for Parkinson's disease, for people who suffer from a stroke, for example, and generally for people that have their cognitive functions impaired at some point during their lives. And it works because they can exercise in VR certain cognitive tasks, and it's very efficient. Now, when it comes to structural plasticity, exposure therapy is maybe the best example of how VR is a very compelling environment and how these experiences are very compelling for us. So we have exposure therapy for a lot of things, usually for different phobias. So people treat their anxieties or phobias in VR, like agoraphobia or fear of heights, or fear of spiders, and so on and so forth. And we also have cognitive and behavioral therapy being carried out in VR. And to a great extent, they're very successful applications of VR. But now, what's interesting to me, and what's interesting is that those area of research are almost never overlapped in the literature, is that we also have some results that come in from studying the effect of VR on certain human capacities, cognitive capacities, or moral capacities. So the results of investigating the impact of VR. And this is an example, I give this example because we published an article on this topic of VR and empathy enhancement. A classical example is the impact that VR experiences can have on our empathic functions. And this is a study that I really like to quote. It's a study from 2018 when Sofia Steinfeld and her colleagues from Barcelona placed some male domestic violence offenders into the avatars of female victims in immersive VR to explore how their perceptions of facial expressions associated with fear, anger, and usually, facial features that have a negative valence would change as a result of those experiences. And the results of this experiment were very interesting because they observed that those domestic violence offenders actually performed better after the experience in their ability to correctly identify facial cues that have a negative valence. So we have some data that supports this hypothesis that VR experiences in certain conditions can improve our theory of mind, so we can better understand how other people's minds work and how they perceive certain situations by engaging in perspective-taking exercises. So as I said before, these new technologies, such as virtual reality, can be extremely useful in this regard. If they are immersive, engaging, if we have access to first-person perspective, and if we embody an avatar. And this is a picture of how this experience actually looks like. Now, what I think that is very interesting is that if all those studies that correlates having certain virtual experiences in VR with an increase in empathy um, are actually to hold water, then we see that empathy can be trained, right? So it's like a moral muscle, or at least we develop a habitual disposition when we constantly engage in situations that um, require us to be empathetic towards certain groups of people that we otherwise would not necessarily be empathetic towards. Um, we also have a host of other examples on how VR experiences can shift our perspective regarding certain things. These are some examples of perspective shifting when it comes to imagining your future self. So being exposed to your older self can um, help you connect more vividly to your future self. You can be motivated to save more money for your future self. You will invest more in your pension fund and so on and so forth. Um, but these are not the only promising applications of VR. I'm going to give you two other examples that I find relevant. Another example um, is related to empathy modulation, but somehow different. Um, and I'm referring to the augmentation of moral understanding. And a very interesting example is self-knowledge. So many VR users say that by engaging in virtual experiences and by inhabiting an avatar, they actually gain important information about themselves. That is that part of our self-knowledge that is inferential in nature, right? Um, if I make certain decisions in VR, if I choose to behave in certain ways, then I'm going to uh, infer from that particular experience is that probably I'm going to behave similarly in different contexts that are similar to the virtual experience. And whether or not that is true, it certainly contributes to the way in which we understand ourselves and to the way in which we understand our role into the world. So that can be potentially very important. Now, when discussing virtual immersive experiences, usually philosophers focus on some classical problems. I call them classical problems because you're going to find um, these discussions in almost every article on VR and research ethics. So almost every article that you're going to find in this area warns us that um, research subjects can be exposed to psychological harm, cyber sickness, obviously, and some more pervasive phenomena such as derealization and depersonalization. And these are the classical issues. Um, the classical example of psychological harm is from an experiment carried out in VR, where they try to replicate the results of Milgram's experiment, the famous Milgram experiment, or rather the infamous Milgram experiment. And as a result of it, participants reported increased psychological distress. So that was a classical example of a no-no experiment in VR. So psychological harm is definitely something that should be researched extensively when it comes to carrying out research, right, in VR, especially because VR is used more and more for sacrificial dilemmas and so on and so forth. But now, I think that the problem with virtual immersive experiences lies somewhere else primarily. And it lies in a place that is often overlooked, I think, by people who write on research ethics. And in the same article that I was discussing, that I was talking about earlier, we came up with what we call the 4 E's of empathy training, that we thought can help us build a compelling virtual experience that has an impact on the way in which we empathize with others. And the 4 traits of these experiences that we arrived at are experience, the quality, and the fact that those experiences are diverse and probably you wouldn't have access to them in real life. And engagement, but engagement not in a technical sense. So not as the first level of immersion, but we refer to the fact that we have a causal impact on virtual objects and everything that happens in the virtual world. So we can refer to the sense of agency, the fact that we believe that we are the agents that are causing repercussions in the virtual world, and the sense of responsibility, which are interestingly not correlated, but yeah, that's another discussion. Environmental control, so the fact that we have control over the design of the world, and we can control the stimuli and the things that users and participants are exposed to, and embodiment. But now, looking at those traits, at those VR experience traits, my question is if they have any kind of normative significance. Because in this article, we simply describe a type of experience that seems to have certain results. But looking back on those traits, I do believe that they carry a normative significance when we think about the content of VR experiences and how we should think about research ethics in this area. So my proposal is that, given the fact that VR piggybacks, as I said, on our neuroplasticity, in those cases on our structural neuroplasticity, and given the fact that it is quite easy, it would appear, to reinforce certain messages or to curate events or interactions that can impact significantly our values, our beliefs, and our behaviors, for better or for worse, obviously, because we focus on moral enhancement, but the converse thesis is also true, right? They can also be quite harmful. So those virtual experiences, I think, are morally loaded in each and every case. So there's always a normative stance that underpins every virtual experience that we engage in. So obviously, their effect is going to vary from user to user or from research participant, taking into account the kind of beliefs that they have regarding the status of these particular experiences. So some people might say, okay, it's just a game, it's not serious. So that can very well be the case. But for the most people, I would say that those repercussions are very serious, potentially very serious. So I would say that we need ethical guidelines for VR content, not for various professions as we have at the moment. But I would say that professional practices are very important in setting the bar for permissibility. So various things that are permissible for, I don't know, research settings might not be permissible for simulators and so on and so forth. But I would say that VR ethical guidelines should always depart from the technical aspects of VR experiences. So if they are hyper immersive, if they use the first-person perspective, if users have a heightened sense of agency, and so on and so forth. And starting from those technical aspects of VR experiences, we should move towards a more granular analysis that comes from the particular demands of each and every profession in which we use VR. So I would say that this is what's missing at the moment, this bigger picture of what's happening, what is the content of VR. And that means a greater responsibility for VR developers, and also a greater responsibility for those people that do carry out research in VR environments. Yeah, okay. And this is my proposal. This is my email address. If you have questions, comments that you won't have time to ask today. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anda. As you promised, it was all at once, all-encompassing presentation. Thank you very much. Thanks again to all of our speakers, to Catherine, to Mihaela, and to Anda. We don't have like a machine for applauses, but we can like do this visually. So we move to our last section, the Q&A section, and we already have two questions. I will start with the second one for Catherine. Is moral reasoning affected by what you described from this virtual moral testing slash action? This is the first question. The second one, is reasoning somehow undermined? Can the role of moral reasoning be restricted or replaced? So, Catherine.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I don't have a clear answer for this, but I definitely have some thoughts. So we're doing a big empirical study at the moment, putting trained philosophers and ethicists in virtual reality moral dilemmas. And part of the reason for that was to tap into this question. So it was to look at whether moral reasoning is challenged or somehow affected by that experience, and whether those experts perceive there being some value in the simulation. And it's really interesting. So we finished collecting the data just before Christmas. So we're actually analyzing it at the moment. And a big part of that process was actually getting rich qualitative responses from the trained philosophers. And there seems to be a pattern emerging whereby you do see this very distinct sort of binomial distribution. So there's two very distinct groups. One group that doesn't shift, doesn't change perspective, has thought about these cases for a long time and doesn't seem to shift their moral reasoning at all. And in the other case, there's a group of individuals who find themselves incredibly surprised by how emotional the experience was, and how their emotions began to play a role in their moral reasoning, which is quite interesting. So while they don't necessarily shift or change their moral reasoning, they're suddenly aware of that shift and that change. So I think that's going to help maybe contribute to starting to answer the question that's really nicely put by in the chat. The other thing I would say, just really quickly on this point, is thinking about visual mental imagery and whether that affects moral reasoning as well. So if you think about, so we know from individual differences research now that actually individual differences in vividness of mental imagery are really stark. So some people are able to visualize things very clearly in their mind's eye, and other people are very limited in the extent to which they can do that. So we should start to think about how that's impacting moral decision making. So if you can simulate and imagine a case in your head, maybe virtual reality actually distracts from that and could then restrict moral reasoning to a certain degree. If, on the other hand, your vividness of mental imagery is somehow constrained or limited, it might be that virtual reality enables and aids that in some way. So I think it's I'm not answering your question, but I think what I'm trying to say is it's an important question, and one that I hope we will have answers to at some point soon.
Thank you, Catherine. We still have enough time for the next years to answer, really answer to this question through experiments and philosophical reasoning, of course, psychology and philosophy united. We move to the second, which actually is like the first question, for Mihaela. I'd like your comment on the crime in the metaverse, which has been investigated by the British police. A case of a girl raped in metaverse by a gang. Who would you think has the moral, not legal, responsibility in this case? So please, Mihaela.
Many thanks. Just to directly answer the question, besides those committing that crime, I think it is important to highlight the role of companies that enable these environments. And I think the way that we develop these new normative frameworks to ascribe moral responsibility have to focus, I think, primarily on those companies enabling these infrastructures and not taking enough steps to prevent these types of crimes. And I think what happened in social media, and Constantin has I think this time last year, right, published an article on infrastructures in social media. I think that the way things evolved for the worse in social media platforms is already a good indicator for what we might expect for the metaverse when it's going to be deployed, if it's going to be deployed to the extent that it is estimated. My answer would rather focus on the companies making possible the types of interactions in the metaverse and making them morally responsible for not taking enough preventive measures for such bad events happening.
Okay, thank you, Mihaela. And another question to all of you from Vicky. Thank you, Vicky, again. What is your overall impression for researchers in VR? Do they usually understand the range and complexity of ethical issues that this technology and consequently their research involves? I guess, says Vicky, this may vary according to their background, but what is your impression? So it's a question addressed to all of you.
This is a question for Catherine.
And not only, not only.
I mean, I can give a perspective from psychology, definitely. So I think there aren't many of us who use VR for answering these bigger societal and global and moral questions. For the most part, VR has been used in cognitive psychology and sort of vision science. And in those cases, I think the ethical questions aren't as apparent to the research teams. And because they've been using the technology now for a very long time, I don't think there's much sense of what the new emerging technology will bring to those fields and how it might challenge them. From a social psychological perspective, I would say that I think some of the implementations and use of VR have been reasonably careless. And that's probably because we haven't started having these very informed ethical discussions about VR until, now. So Anda really nicely mentioned the Milgram replication in VR. And I think that's a good example of it being used without too much consideration about for the consequences. I'm hoping that sessions like this one and some of the work that Eric Ramirez is writing about will make people more cautious and more aware. And then biased from a moral perspective, I think anyone with any understanding of moral philosophy and moral psychology is just inherently more sensitive and perhaps a little more careful about the implementation of this technology. That's my perception for what I've seen. But Michaela and Anda, you might have slightly different views or perspectives.
I think I'd rather leave Anda maybe here to add a point, as her research was more directly concerned with VR experiments, maybe than mine.
Yes, it's just that I never carried one myself. So, but I interacted with people that carry out research in VR. So, if that helps. So usually I think that people are very excited when it comes to doing research in VR, um, or at least based on all the discussions that we had um, in the past years, discussing potential collaborations and so on and so forth. It is a level of excitement that you don't often see when you discuss potential collaborations on other topics or I don't know, with something else. Um, but at the same time, yeah, I know that the ethical concern is not very present when it comes to doing research in VR, and the ethical standards are going to vary a lot from country to country. Uh, so in Romania, it's going to be a lot easier, for example, to conduct um, research in VR at the moment compared to other countries that already have some regulations in place in their review boards. So in Romania is still a non-issue, partly because there are not that many experiments carried out in VR. So we have a lot of studies in VR in psychology dealing with exposure therapy, but as far as I know, we don't have anything other than that. And you can correct me, Konstantin Mihaela, if I'm wrong. Um, but that shows that there is a lack of general interest in ethical guidelines in this particular domain.
Yeah, I can confirm this. I guess there are no research ethics committees or commissions or internal review boards in Romania already having this kind of guidelines for research in VR. What, as far as I know, in Romania we started to have at least some guidelines for using AI in research. So it's a first step. Maybe the next one will be about VR and so on and so forth. There is another question for Anda. Let me read it. Given the synaptic pruning might be stronger for young adults, should they be excluded from VR research groups as the impact on them might be stronger in a harmful sense? Should the age for VR testing be different from the legal age of participating in such tests? I guess this question could also be open to our speakers, but first of all, the first target is Anda. So please.
Yeah. So I don't know if synaptic pruning is actually stronger in young adults because synaptic pruning is researched. Um, so they say that leaving aside developmental um, uh, changes, so the things that are specific to the early human developmental stages, synaptic pruning is something that um, is specific to every age. So this is not or this is not one of the reasons why children and young adults might be vulnerable when exposed to VR experiences. But at the same time, I would say that there are problems of obviously consent. So I would not necessarily recommend uh, having people under the legal age participating in certain research experiments. And they're definitely a vulnerable group. But at the same time, we know that, I don't know, children, young adults use a lot of VR for entertainment purposes. So there's also that. They might be, they might be, I don't know, desensitized, or they might have a different kind of report with VR technologies compared to people that they're not regular VR users. So yeah, at least that is my intuition. I don't know.
Maybe to add here a point, which is rather maybe a meta discussion, we might also be needing to discuss the limits of young adults, the age limits of what we currently define as young adults, as what we define as adolescents. As far as I know, this has been quite an ongoing discussion, including in not only in cognitive science, but also neuroethics for the past decades or so. And yeah, an answer to this point might also infringe upon the type of experimental design setup in VR that we're going to witness.
Okay, thank you. I guess we are somehow going closer and closer to end this webinar. If there are no other questions, uh, I wrote some questions for you, but I can send them by email, so don't worry. Uh, so thank you again. Thank you again. Congrats. Thank you for your marvelous talks. They are very helpful for us in our project, and not only for us to understand how the new ethical framework should be developed in order to have a good approach in VR research and in the metaverse at large. The project changes goes for the next 2 years. We are now in the second year. We started the second year. In 2 weeks, there will be a big meeting in Vienna with the whole the whole team. Many thanks again. You can find us by Googling Changer Project EU. It's pretty easy. It's the first result. You can find us on LinkedIn and X or X Twitter. As we like to say, be part of Changer, be a game changer in research ethics. So thank you again for this afternoon, and good luck for everybody. Thank you again.